We are continuing to follow the breaking news down in Miami, where for the first time a former U.S. president has been arraigned on federal criminal charges. Just a few hours ago, Donald Trump turned himself in for what is his second criminal indictment. The first, of course, having been in New York. In Miami, he made his first appearance in a federal courtroom, responding to the 37 counts charged by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith related to mishandling classified documents, obstruction of justice, and making false statements. Appearing with him was his personal valet, an alleged co-conspirator, Waltine Nauta, who was indicted alongside Trump for his alleged role in moving dozens of boxes of documents, all while being caught on surveillance video and then lying about it to the FBI. At no point did Trump say a word to U.S. Magistrate Judge John Goodman. It was his lawyer, Todd Blanche, who pleaded not guilty on his behalf. The only restriction placed on Trump by the judge during the brief hearing is that he is not to have any contact specifically about the case with any possible witnesses, including Nauta, who still works for Trump. I guess that will be based on the honor system. No date was set for the next hearing, which as of now would be handled by Trump-appointed Judge Aileen Cannon, who will preside over the trial. Cannon is the judge whose past decisions in this very case were twice overturned by the conservative 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in scathing opinions. Co-defendant Walt Nauta will be arraigned in 2 weeks because he had no local counsel present today. Upon leaving the court, followed closely by Nauta, in his valet role, Trump waved from his motorcade to supporters who had gathered there. But unlike the violent supporters who showed up on January 6th prepared to mount an insurrection, today it was more of a circus-like atmosphere outside the court, more in step with what you might expect from a Miami festival. And while he remained silent in court, Trump made a quick stop to greet voters at Miami's Versailles restaurant, which is a hub for the conservative and very Republican Cuban exile community. He then hopped a flight back to New Jersey to his golf course, Bedminster, allegedly the scene where Trump waved around purported classified documents per the indictment. He's expected to deliver remarks from there in the next hour. I have a great panel of legal experts to discuss this historic day. But first, I want to bring in MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin, who was in the courtroom for the arraignment today. Set the scene for us, Lisa, of how that went.
Hi, Joy. It was, in some respects, an ordinary arraignment, and in others, anything but, because we had the former president of the United States being arraigned alongside his co-defendant and his valet, Walt Nauta, who, as you noted in an earlier hour today, is really an ordinary man trapped in extraordinary circumstances by virtue of his proximity to Donald Trump. One of the things that I was struck by today is how Trump's lawyers were actually talking to Nauta during the arraignment today. The other thing that I thought was absolutely bizarre and certainly not typical is that when Donald Trump was done entering his plea and they had negotiated the bond, when he stood up to leave, 2 rows of Secret Service agents right behind him stood up, got into formation, and headed toward an exit of the courtroom typically used for criminal defendants that are in detention. And they fell into a single line. And right behind them in that line was Walt Nauta, who in that moment ceased to be Trump's co-defendant and went right back to his role as Trump's body man and principal aide. Just like he was the night that Trump had dinner with Kanye West, Walt Nauta is always there. And I've had folks ask me today, is Walt Nauta likely to cooperate? Is that the significance of his not entering a plea today? I don't believe so. I might have thought that was what was going on by virtue of his not appearing with local counsel. But again, a person who's about to cooperate doesn't leave the courtroom in the role of as employee to his co-defendant. A person who's about to cooperate doesn't go with him to Versailles in the Cuban community, as you noted, and hold the door open for him. Walt Nauta is a person who is playing a role very different from many co-defendants in conspiracy cases. Most of those folks have every incentive to cooperate. Walt Nauta seems to have decided that his incentive structure is something otherwise, Joy.
It is bizarre as bizarre gets, but I do want to ask one more question, and this is regarding how things went down before they actually showed up in court, and that is the question of being booked. Both Nauta and Trump were, quote-unquote, booked today. But please explain how only Nauta, Waltine Nauta, had to take a mugshot.
Yeah, my understanding from the U.S. Marshals Service and our own Ken Delanian and Adam Reese spoke to them earlier today is that rather than use a mugshot that was taken during the booking process with respect to former President Trump, they saved him that indignity and used a publicly available photograph. So you're right. Walt Nauta went through all the usual hallmarks of the booking process. Donald Trump, on the other hand, still bearing some of the former trappings and respect accorded to a former president. He alone did not, Joy.
Lisa Rubin, thank you very much. Go get yourself a cortadito because you're right in the right place to get it. I'm super jealous because I would like to have one right now. Let's bring in MSNBC Justice and Legal Analyst Anthony Coley. He is a former DOJ spokesperson under Attorney General Merrick Garland. MSNBC Legal Analyst Tali Farhadian Weinstein. She is a former federal and state prosecutor and once clerked for Judge Merrick Garland. Nick Ackerman, former Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor and former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Dave Aronberg, State Attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida. I feel incredibly undereducated being on this panel with these illustrious guests. I don't even know where to begin, but I want to start with the mugshots. And I will throw this out to, I'm going to start. Well, you know what? I'm going to start with you, Nick Ackerman.
Sure, I don't have a mugshot.
You don't have a mugshot either. But look, let me tell you something. I have some really cute beauty shots of myself, and I would think that if I ever found myself in some sort of legal problem, I would like to send them a beauty shot of me and have myself look like I look right now.
Underneath your chin.
When Bailey has done me fabulously and I look like this. Why does Trump get to do this? But I wouldn't get to do that. I would not get to do that. I would have to take a mugshot. You would have to take a mugshot. Right. Any of us would have to take a mugshot. Why is it that Donald Trump, yes, he's not president anymore, but when you're not president, you're just a citizen. How does that make sense that he didn't have to take a mugshot?
I think probably the same reason they didn't do it in New York. I think the concern is that somebody in the system would pull that out and send it out to people.
So what? Well, Donald Trump is not subject to any further saying that it spared him the indignity. This man has been indicted twice.
Right.
That is indignity in and of itself, and it's indignity that he brought upon himself.
Yeah,
why does he get spared that?
Well, the other reason, supposedly, is because if he is a fugitive, they need a mugshot to be able to identify him. And this is a guy who everybody identifies. It's not like he's not a person that isn't easily identifiable.
Yeah, well, that is true. Well, we don't know what his hair looks like in the mugshot because we don't know if he gets to do the swoop with the mugshot. So let me go to this next piece, because this is the other thing that I was taking notes as Lisa was talking that I found very odd. Trump's lawyer talking to Nauta's lawyer.
Right.
Unusual in the sense that these two are charged in a conspiracy together, and yet I don't know that their interests all 100% align. Can you make sense of them talking to each other?
I can. I mean, so we don't know if they have a joint defense agreement that would give some structure to how they talk to each other, but their individual lawyers are supposed to represent their separate interests. And I think the reason that they can't speak to each other directly, which is a very common condition, and one of the ones that was imposed today, is we don't want them to coordinate their stories with each other and somehow distort, what they would otherwise say.
Doing that? Nauta works for him. He's his valet.
Yeah. Well, yes. And the other thing is that we really don't want one of them to unduly influence, pressure, tamper with the other. And you said honor system. I think that's right. This is really hard to enforce. But I also think that this is something that the Department of Justice is going to be monitoring.
They're going to have to. And I don't know how they're going to do it, Anthony, honestly. So the challenge for the people, it's the people versus Donald Trump and versus Waltine Nauta, but versus Donald Trump, is that Donald Trump, he went right to Versailles after his moment, in court. And let me just give you a quote from somebody who was inside of Versailles. Now, people who don't know Miami very well don't understand that Versailles is the hub for Cuban Americans, but for a certain section of Cuban Americans, meaning the most conservative, sort of older Cuban Americans. It's where they go. It's actually great food. And it's wonderful. But it's great food. No, and the coffee is amazing. But I mean, it is where Republicans go. This is what one person said. The Versailles crowd enthusiastically agreed with Trump's assessment of the legal system. In this country exists a system of justice that is not justice. If you have the last name Clinton or Biden, you have you have one system of justice. If you have the last name Trump, it's another system of justice, said Enrique Canton in Spanish, who stood in front of Versailles many times to make his pro-Trump voice heard. But the people, in terms of the Justice Department, are relatively silent. There will only be a megaphone held by one side, and that is Donald Trump. What is the challenge the Justice Department faces in communicating what they're doing?
Right. Joy, there are two courts in this country. It's the Court of Justice, and then it's the Court of Public Opinion. In terms of the Court of Justice, Donald Trump doesn't have a very strong case. Right. We've seen the facts. I'm not going to go through them ad nauseum here,
sure.
But the facts here are just so overwhelming against him. The surveillance video, et cetera. But it's the Court of Public Opinion that he's really trying to sway the hearts and the minds of everybody. That's why it is so important for the Justice Department to keep the focus of this case on the facts. We talked earlier today, I think, when you and I were both on with Nicole, about the need for the Justice Department to, at its very core, agree when petitioned by media organizations to allow there to be at least an audio recording.
Absolutely.
Of the proceeding.
Or cameras in the courtroom.
That's exactly right. Because Donald Trump, as he's doing today, he's in the middle of a campaign.
That's right.
And so that's what absolutely has got to happen.